When the ocean wants to do what it does, you just have to stand back.
After two back-to-back storms brought massive devastation to the Maine coast.
The whole place had to be pulled apart.
There's lingering damage and pressing concerns 1 year later.
That this is more urgent than we ever thought before.
State and federal money has poured in to help, but is it enough?
We'll probably have to put $1 million or so of our own money into the repairs.
Towns up and down the coast now coming up with their own plans before the next big storm hits. Good evening. Tonight, looking back and looking ahead as we forecast our future here tonight. Thanks for being with us. I'm John Quasos.
And I'm Megan Torgeson alongside with Kathleen Jordan and Scott McDonald. Tonight, we are marking 1 year since two of the worst coastal storms to ever hit our state.
In the months since back-to-back disasters, many lessons have been learned. Perhaps the most obvious, the Maine coast is vulnerable.
And another lesson, some coastal communities are better equipped to handle extreme weather than others. Tonight, we'll take a look at how last January's storms reshaped the Maine landscape and called the future of waterfront communities from Wells to Rockland into question. And that includes the future of Maine's famous lobster and fishing industry. At least 60% of Maine's working waterfront was either severely damaged or just completely wiped out.
All told, the governor's office estimated the storms cost $90 million in public infrastructure damage.
Storm surge combined with high tides ripped away entire wharves and piers, ran boats aground, and left valuable fishing equipment and lobster gear just floating in the ocean.
You know, normally we get a storm, we go clean up the messes, patch whatever broke, replace a plank, things like that, and we're back to normal. We haven't had enough time to clean up from the last one yet.
The storms have ruined a lot of docks, and that is a lot for the lobstermen because they have to now work to fix them and figure out new ways to store their traps and everything. But
lobstermen were left scrambling to rebuild before the May fishing season. We're still waiting on the numbers of the lobster haul for the 2024 catch, but their catch was already down by 11% in 2023 amid new restrictions and the fact that lobsters have been moving north to colder waters off the coast of Canada. But lobstermen are known for their grit and ability to overcome challenges.
Absolutely, and the same can be said for coastal residents too, who are fighting hard to protect Maine's unique coastal identity.
Tonight, we'll also share some remarkable examples of resiliency and preparedness. We'll go over efforts to rebuild stronger and smarter, including the efforts of homeowners in York County paying a lot of money to protect their properties. Also, those preservation groups right now trying to make sure Maine's beloved landmarks don't get destroyed when that next storm hits.
First, though, a look at how our state and federal leaders have tried to help here. Since last January, FEMA has approved more than $4.7 million in assistance for 800 households impacted by the storms. That is on top of the $60 million the Maine legislature approved last year, which is the most Maine has ever spent on storm recovery.
And just this week, a new proposal from Governor Janet Mills, supported by leaders of both parties. The first bill the new legislature introduced on Tuesday aims to help Maine respond to severe weather and the long-term impacts of climate change. The bill is based on recommendations from the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resiliency Commission, which was created after the storms in December of 2023 that saw rivers swell inland, causing major flooding.
Those three storms in December and January were overwhelming. I think we felt like, oh my gosh, not another storm. And I think Maine people are concerned for the future. So I think the fact that we are seeing investments starting to pay off, we are seeing people proactively think about how to protect people, I think that's hopeful.
That group is preparing a long-term infrastructure plan to be revealed in March, but the governor says that her bill is an emergency measure to help meet urgent challenges.
And there are several initiatives in the governor's proposal. Jackie Mundry will break all of them down for us coming up a little later in this hour. One, though, we can tell you right now includes the launch of an online tool that shows how vulnerable your area is to flooding. It's called the Flood Ready Maine program, and it would also boost the number of flood insurance policies here in the state. Take a look. Only 1.3% of all homes and buildings in Maine are currently covered under the National Flood Insurance Program. That is well below the national average of 3.3%. And the governor says her bill is part of Maine's updated plan to respond to the global climate crisis.
That this is more urgent than we ever thought before even. And although we've taken it seriously for 6 years, we're taking it even more seriously. All the communities around Maine are taking it seriously. Hardly any town in Maine was left unharmed by those storms in December and January and then April too.
Experts at the National Weather Service and the Maine Climate Council are sounding similar alarms right now. According to their research, as climate change continues and sea levels rise, the frequency and intensity of storms is expected to increase.
At the same time, though, no one weather event can be directly linked to climate change, and there's more to the story when it comes to last year's storms.
A slight difference in the wind direction contributed to that destruction when the tide came in. Maine's chief meteorologist Roger Griswold explains how the first storm formed and why it packed such a punch.
It was nearly 1 year ago when two back-to-back storms impacted us along the coast of Maine. But if you thought those storms were nor'easters, you'd be wrong. That's because the storms on January 10th and the one that followed just 3 days later were what we call sou'easters. Instead of having a northeast wind, which runs parallel to the coast, those two storms had a southeast wind, which was more perpendicular. And that slight difference in the wind direction made all the difference as far as the impact up and down the coastline.
The January 10th storm began its life in the Gulf of Alaska, dove southward through British Columbia and across the Rocky Mountains. It was a typical winter storm, bringing blizzard conditions to the Great Plains, with 6 states reporting whiteout conditions. But as it neared New England, the storm tracked to our west instead of running up the coast, like most storms do. This turn allowed the winds to come in directly off the water, bringing a significant impact to our coast. Aided by a strong low-level jet stream, the high winds, heavy rain, and snow plowed into Maine.
So the wind comes in off the water, 55 to 65 miles per hour. Those are your peak wind gusts. And 45 to 55 across interior sections, even lesser amounts. So no big problems here, except that's where the heavy snow is going to be piling up on the trees.
At its peak, Portland measured a gust to 63 miles per hour, with many towns topping 70 miles per hour up and down the coast. Isla Ho reported an amazing 95 mile per hour gust at the height of the storm. Power outages rose rapidly and exceeded 60,000 homes. But the wind wasn't the only aspect of this incredible sou'easter. Snow fell across inland areas, piling up 6 to 12 inches from the lakes to the mountains.
You've got moderate to heavy snow coming down from the lakes region northward. And meanwhile, Portland, although there may be some snow at the onset, I think we're mixing with rain here by midnight.
Meanwhile, back at the coast, the seas continued to rise, soon reaching 23 feet at the weather buoy off Casco Bay. Those waves, coupled with the surge and astronomical high tides, left roads closed, houses destroyed, and permanent damage to the dunes and seawalls meant to protect our coastal communities.
In the end, it was the mid-coast that bore the brunt of that first storm. But only 3 days later, a second storm would impact the region. Meteorologist Colleen Hurley picks up the story from here.
The second storm was nearly identical to the first, with a strong southeasterly wind creating a storm surge, and this time it hit not just at high tide, but during the highest tide of the month. Greater Portland under flash flood warning, and then Cape Elizabeth all the way down the coast experiencing this record flooding.
Another sou'easter. Just 3 days later, the two storms so similar that if you overlay their pressure maps, you can see they're nearly the same. It was the 9th biggest storm surge on record, but because it was the highest tide of the month with southeasterly winds instead of northeasterly, the water came up higher and extended further inland than ever before.
The water level in Portland has now exceeded that of the blizzard of 78. So this is the highest the water level has ever gotten in the Portland area, which means more and more roads and businesses and families are going to be affected that have never been affected by coastal storm surge flooding in our area.
Winds gusted over 50 miles an hour in the Portland area and approached 70 miles an hour along the mid-coast. Even northern Maine saw a 78-mile-an-hour wind gust with this storm. Buoys in the Gulf of Maine were reporting 25-foot waves. The Rockland breakwater disappeared beneath the surf.
It was cray-cray. I mean, there were waves that were crashing over. The boardwalk was inundated with water, debris, biggest pieces of lumber you've ever seen. But it was the craziest high tide I've ever seen in Rockland.
All along the coast, homes and businesses flooded or taken by the waves. A fishing vessel ran ashore near Cape Elizabeth. Water covered the roads in the Old Port and surged into neighborhoods near Higgins Beach. The worst of the storm occurred between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. around the noontime high tide. Dunes and protective barriers were destroyed, and the repair process continues to this day. While storm surge has been higher with nor'easters, it was the southeasterly winds lining up with the high tide hitting an already damaged coastline that made this storm so destructive. January 13th, 2024 now holds the #1 spot over the blizzard of '78 as the worst coastal flood in Maine's history.
Our coastline was changed twice that week. Structures swept away like the fishing shacks here at Willard Beach, and dunes destroyed, making us even more vulnerable to storm surge in the future. In South Portland, meteorologist Colleen Hurley, Maine's Total Weather.
And as Colleen just mentioned, the second storm was much more destructive because the first storm wiped out the coast's natural barriers and defenses. Here's an example right here. Take a look at that happening in Stonington, one of the state's top lobster ports.
Waves from the first storm taking out chunks of the saltwater marsh and worsening erosion. The town was one of several that has drafted plans to mitigate against sea level rise in the coming year.
But it's work that takes time that many residents don't believe that they have.
So for now, fishermen in Stonington have been relying on the forecasts to determine when they should bring their boats to shore to avoid any damage to their vessels.
All right, a lot more to go over tonight, including the impact storms have had on Maine's power grid. Why does Maine lead the nation in prolonged outages? So what are Maine's utility companies doing to try and change that?
Waterfront property owners deciding to build up, hoping to protect their investment after last year's historic storm.
The damage from two extreme weather events we've been talking about tonight left many scars along the coast.
They sure did. They also left a mark on the history books. Meteorologist Ted McInerney explains how both of last January's storms broke records.
Living on the Maine coast, you are always at the mercy of the Atlantic Ocean. We are used to big ocean storms and know if they hit at high tide, it'll be worse. The storms of the winter of 1978 have always been the worst case scenario. Until January 2024. January 10th sou'easter came in with so much velocity, waves offshore climbed to 23 feet, and maritime winds screamed to 90 miles an hour. The storm surge, which is the rise in water level above the predicted high tide, was 4 feet, the third highest water level on record. Combine all of that with a tide coming in.
With some sea level rise, an astronomical high tide, and wave runoff, and wave velocity pounding over these rocks and flowing into downtown Portland.
That put the 10th of January at the fourth highest storm tide on record at 13.84 feet, inches away from the all-time record. 72 hours later, another sou'easter, and this time an astronomical high tide. With a beaten down and more vulnerable coastline from the storm days before, the all-time record in Portland was shattered, surpassing February 7th, 1978's storm. Looking at the top 10 list, notice how many storms have made it into the record books in the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, even the March 10th storm last year made it to number 8.
Standing here, it's hard not to think what comes next. For now, all we can do is stay prepared, stay informed, and work towards solutions to protect our coastal communities. For forecasting our future, I'm meteorologist Ted McInerney.
We've seen how impactful wind direction and the storm's timing was, but now let's turn to the role global sea level rise has played.
Maine actually preparing for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100.
And while that may seem like a distant, far-off issue, scientists at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute say it's something that we must confront now.
It was their work that concluded back in 2018 that the Gulf of Maine was warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans and has continued to do so in the years since.
Meteorologist Victoria Wisniewski spoke to a scientist from the Institute and brings us more from Old Orchard Beach.
Picture yourself here, the historic Old Orchard Beach Pier. Now, imagine it was all washed away. The storm of '78 did just that. But fortunately, it was rebuilt, a showcase of our resilience. However, that won't always be possible, as rising sea levels continue to pose a risk to Maine's coastline. You may remember the fishermen's shacks off of Willard's Beach. 3 of the original 5 were washed away during the blizzard of '78. Fast forward to January 2024, as ripping winds and crashing waves took out the remaining 2 in Casco Bay, washing away a landmark known for generations.
The two key ingredients that were part of the storm compared to other storms was that, yes, there's long-term sea level rise. Also, there was a spike in mean sea level in late 2023 and early 2024.
But this does not happen overnight. In the past, these spikes have been related to variations in our winds, air pressure, and sea levels north of the Gulf. But scientists are still asking questions to why this occurred in late 2023. As Dr. Baranis explains, the severe storm impacts were a result of sea level rise and a series of bad die rolls.
It was kind of moderately severe storm surge hitting at one of the highest tides of the entire year and on top of this really particularly high sea level. And then last bad die roll, it was a storm with a southeast wind direction instead of a northeast wind direction. But having that at the same time as the high tide and the high sea level, that is what led to these really unprecedented impacts in Maine.
So what happens next? Maine's coastal infrastructure was not built to withstand these changes. And this is where the challenge arises. As our coastal storms become more common, Maine has committed to manage 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100. As our climate continues to change and evolve in ways that humans have not experienced before, it is time that we now acknowledge what is happening in front of our very eyes.
As we reflect on the January storms, Mainers must come together as one.
Even if the future is uncertain, we know that coming together will make us stronger.
To preserve coastal communities and landmarks you've known for generations, as it only takes one storm to land in our history books.
After all, Maine is our home. Maine is your home.
Technology is getting smarter and smarter every day, and so is the power grid.
We are constantly looking at the system, constantly looking at upgrades.
So even when a storm doesn't make the record books, Mainers often lose power. So up next, where millions are being spent to address some of the vulnerabilities in the state's power grid.
So in the years since, those back-to-back coastal storms caused horrific flooding and thousands of power outages across the coast. Maine's power companies have had to continue to study ways to mitigate damage in the future. Jamie Aguilé spoke to Central Maine Power about what they're doing to protect and improve their power infrastructure.
These days, we've all heard of the smartphone, but have you heard of the smart grid?
Automated technology now controls substations like this one in Biddeford from the 24/7 Energy Control Center in Augusta.
They can take a large outage, get the majority of customers or a large majority of customers back on in minutes, and then dispatch crews to make the final repairs to restore power to remaining customers.
Using remote technology programmed into the substations, operators can sectionalize an outage, switching power from one source to another, keeping it mostly contained to the specific fault area. This substation in Biddeford delivers power to more than 3,500 customers. It's the most recently completed smart grid project, but there are still more than 20 to come.
We're all, as a state and as a community, working to figure out how to harden against these more extreme storms. One of the things that we can do is add more technology to the grid so that we can minimize outage times and get power back on for our customers.
That's work CMP says is important for their customers, who they know rely on uninterrupted power. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reports Maine saw the most outages in the country in 2023, and the average length of those outages was the highest as well, nearly doubling since 2022.
We're really all in this together. We are constantly looking at the system, constantly looking at upgrades.
In addition to technology improvements, CMP is also installing wider poles, adding tree wire to prevent outages caused by fallen trees, replacing some of the wooden infrastructure with fiberglass, and continuing to develop strategy in their climate change studies and resilience plan. Versant Power is conducting climate studies and working to mitigate storm damage as well. In the past year, they've replaced substations, equipment, and wires, and are working to open a new substation too.
Even with all of these changes and improvements, there's still a chance that you could lose power. So remember that you can always report those outages online. For Maine's Total Weather, I'm Jamie Aguilé.
And still ahead tonight, 2024 was the Earth's warmest year on record. Scientists at NASA and NOAA releasing their new temperature report up next. Experts explain the link between these temperature trends and severe weather.
As we've been detailing here tonight, a major aspect of last January's record storms was the timing. They happened during the new moon, and new moons drive higher tides.
A tough combo there as the strong winds were also the primary driver of the record storm surge we saw.
But what kind of a role did sea level rise due to global warming, warming temperatures rather, play in the storm's severity?
NASA and NOAA has just released its global temperature report for 2024, showing that the average surface temperature was the hottest on record, topping 2023's record. Today I had the chance to speak with a climate scientist at NOAA and asked him to explain the link between these temperature trends and this extreme weather.
Storms not only are wetter than they used to be, but with sea levels rising, especially those storms that kind of push the water onshore across Maine, as you raise sea levels, you're basically saying now there's a higher point, a baseline for you to now have that water come on shore. Think of it this way. I can't dunk a basketball on a 10-foot net, but if you give me a 5-foot platform, I can dunk a basketball. Similar things with sea level rise. If you raise the sea levels, you're basically saying it's easier to create coastal flooding. And you won't necessarily need a storm of the century to cause flooding in the future. You could have a weaker storm produce similar coastal flooding due to sea levels rising.
What can Maine's coastal residents expect in the future?
Well, you could expect to see sea levels to continue to rise, and that could lead to an increase in days leading to high tide flooding, which is just flooding due to the tides themselves. You also might see there be increased beach erosion. You also might see, when there are storms, that water penetrate further inland than you've seen in the past. So it's important to be aware of what the weather forecast is saying about what you should do, and also be aware of the impacts to your coastal communities moving forward.
And the governor wants Maine to be a leader in addressing climate change. On Tuesday, just this week, Governor Mills introduced the first piece of new legislation, and it's aimed at increasing our preparedness and resiliency ahead of the next extreme weather event.
Jackie Mundry explains the work the state's Climate Council has been doing since these storms and how this new legislation will help those who work and live on our coast.
Will it be this year, next year, or 5 years from now when we have another big storm like that?
So where did it go out? Bob Baines fishes out of South Thomaston and has a front row seat to climate change.
As the water level rises, it's going to make some of these docks submerged, but the lobster season...
He and his fellow fishermen at the Sprucehead Co-op didn't have as much damage as some other parts of the coast, but still needed funding to rebuild after last winter's storms.
We had big sea rolling in, big tides, water came up over the docks, into the parking lots, into the bait house. Some damage was done, but not severe damage like other harbors.
Baines, a Maine Lobstermen Association board member, was asked to join the Maine Climate Council to look at last winter's storms and better prepare our state for future storms. Now, Governor Janet Mills is proposing bipartisan legislation to do just that. All 4 caucus leaders are sponsoring the bill and joining her in these efforts.
And so the policies we need to look at are what can we do to hopefully prevent the worst, and what can we do to make sure that we adapt and we're nimble and that we're fully ready for any crises that might happen in the future.
So I think we need to focus on ways that we can build things back quicker, get people help quicker now, rather than all these plans that are supposed to change things 100 years from now.
This new legislation comes from the work done by the Maine Climate Council and the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission, which was established after last winter's storms.
They were a wake-up call that extreme storm events, extreme storm surge events, they were already here. They're not something we were preparing for in the future. They were something that we have to be better prepared for right now.
Now we have LD1, the first bill in the new legislature. If signed into law, it would establish the Home Resiliency Program. This would be a grant program that could give homeowners up to $15,000 to prepare their homes for future storms. It would also allocate money to the state's emergency communication systems, so Mainers know when these storms are coming and can better prepare for them. And it would create a state resilience office and flood ready program with federal funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This office would support planning for storms and look for ways to reduce flood and storm damage when they arise.
Again, we've heard from legislators on both sides of the aisle that this is a priority. So we feel good about that.
Legislation focused on resiliency, much like our working waterfronts.
we've seen the changes, we recognize the changes, but we still get up and go fishing every day.
The governor's storm bill was referred out of both the House and Senate to the Appropriations Committee for consideration. In Augusta, I'm Jackie Mundry for Maine's Total Coverage.
Maine lobsters in the state's near $400 million lobster industry are facing an uncertain future.
That's right. The catch from fishermen in Maine last year fell more than 11% for a total that was the lowest figure since 2009.
Experts blame a number of factors here, including population shifts, ocean acidification, and rapidly warming ocean temperatures. So as a result, lobsters are being pushed north and into deeper waters.
Also interesting to note here, the survival rate of lobster eggs, that is also dropping, leaving some lobstermen worried about the long-term reliability of their whole livelihood.
And those challenges were all present before the January storms hit, destroying the piers and wharves so many fishermen rely on. The scramble to rebuild led to a delayed start for last year's fishing season.
Kate McCusker spoke to those working the waters off the coast of Bremen. Many are putting storm recovery funding to good use, but as Kate found out, they aren't sure if that will be enough.
Am I personally in a position to rebuild this at this point? Probably not.
Bo Marsh owns Community Shellfish, an oyster farm and lobster wharf where local fishermen can sell their catch.
The floodwaters went in.
He says the storms last January badly damaged his business.
Things were just being tossed and turned, and we lost equipment up in that building there.
And left him worried for the future.
It was a disaster.
Yeah, I actually met Bo. Coming from a lobstering family down the road, Sam Belknap knew he could help through his work at the Island Institute.
It was heartbreaking, just that devastation, because these wharves, they're not just businesses. Oftentimes, they're the economic drivers for communities.
So while local fishermen came to help with repairs in the immediate aftermath, Belknap secured a grant for Community Shellfish, as well as 52 other working waterfronts in Maine.
We quickly mobilized a grant fund to provide immediately relief grants to some of these wharves so they could start the rebuilding process in the weeks and months after the storms, because we knew that hot on the heels of these storms was another fishing season.
This grant and money from the state was a huge help for Marsh, yet he worries about the changing climate and says it's expensive to rebuild as strong as he would like.
I mean, if we had all the money in the world, what we would do is we would probably remove this dock and replace it with new pilings and concrete and whatnot. But again, we're a small business and we can't do that. So we have to build and do the best we can with what we have.
Just down the coast, rebuilding efforts continue in one of the hardest hit communities, New Harbor. Matt Moody and his crew were unloading their lobster traps on a brand new dock, and he noted the extra reinforcements made to prepare for future storms.
We raised the height of the dock a foot, chained down everything this time.
Last year, several docks and whole houses were pulled into the ocean in New Harbor. And remnants of the damage can still be seen throughout the area today.
I've only been around 30 years or so, and no, this is definitely the biggest surge.
Moody says it will probably take years for their co-op to financially get back to where they were before, but they're thankful for the community's help through it all.
You know, as a working waterfront, we all work together. The Shaw's restaurant next door let us unload our lobsters over there. So, we made it work with what we had.
The Maine Sea Grant has heard many tales similar to Moody and Marsh in their community conversations, held up and down our coast as a way for Mainers to come together and discuss the impact of the storm.
We've heard a lot of really amazing stories about that sort of really on the ground, local people, neighbors helping neighbors, people really supporting each other in a time of crisis.
In these meetings, people have voiced concerns about the need to formalize communication systems, streamline our permitting process for rebuilding, find accurate waterfront insurance plans, and allow easier access to emergency funding.
Funding to immediately rebuild or clear a road that's causing a peninsula to be isolated.
When the meetings conclude next month, they plan to put together a comprehensive report detailing what they've learned about the best path forward.
There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. And then on the flip side, the hope side is that people are recognizing that since the January storm, the state of Maine has entered into a pretty amazing amount of action around what do we do to prepare for the storms, and how do we ensure that our working waterfronts and waterfront businesses are supported?
We're all learning, so we'll see what happens next time.
The industry will survive. It's a way to make a good living. You just got to, be able to work and work with it.
And while it may be tough, everyone we spoke to believes that working waterfronts are resilient and they can prepare and adapt for future storms. In Bremen, I'm Kate McCusker for Maine's Total Weather.
And just about an hour south from where Kate just was, down the mid-coast in the small fishing village of Georgetown, repairs continue to this day.
As Connor Clement shows us, the town has been hard at work rebuilding the waterfront and the spirit of the community along with it.
I had never seen anything like that.
John Collins has lived in the Georgetown area his entire life. He'll never forget what he saw on January 10th, 2024.
Between the size of the storm, the direction of the wind, the fact that it was a king's tide with the elevated water levels to begin with, how much damage and the scale of the damage was impressive.
Collins, who owns a construction company in town, got to work repairing seawalls for his fellow residents.
Any place that was on the water with the southern exposure, there was basically work being done on almost every one of the houses that was, in that general, area or description.
A day after the storm hit, we saw some of that damage firsthand. This home on Indian Point Road was battered.
There were rocks the size of picnic tables that had been thrown, 100 yards from where the shore had been. Things like that, I don't think you could ever get used to seeing, whether or not you've had a storm like that before. It's unbelievable the stuff that got moved around.
Just off the coast of Georgetown sits Malden Island, a private community that lost a piece of its history. Half of the cookhouse, which you can see here, washed away.
That particular building was like the center of their little island community out there. And just seeing that gone, it's still, when I look out there and see just the shell of it right now, it's still weird not having the whole building there.
On the wharf, the damage was devastating, especially for a community known for its fishing industry.
We had a couple of floats out here that were sunk, got absolutely wrecked during the storm. It was a rodeo.
Stephen Mace, who talked to us a year ago on this very wharf, still can't believe what the storm left behind. He said without hesitation, the community rallied together to build back.
The people who could make the restoration happen were all here immediately.
But unfortunately, the town couldn't help everyone.
A legacy family here lost a wharf and all their gear, and it was remarkable to see a commercial wharf just gone. It's highly unlikely that will be rebuilt. I mean, just the cost of it is too much.
The town had to tap into reserve funds to get repairs started, and over $90,000 from a state grant program helped cover costs as well, to not only make things whole again, but also prepare should a storm like this hit again.
We opened Five Islands Lobster Company on time. They just finished over here on the South Shore. It looks awesome. Georgetown pulled together.
But Mace says you can only prepare so much for Mother Nature.
You'd almost have to tear it down and start all over again to make it 100% resilient.
Most of the work down here by the wharf has been completed. All there's left to do is seeding this part of the reclaim, which will happen in the spring. The town says that this part of the project was one of their biggest accomplishments. Reporting in Georgetown, I'm Connor Clement for Maine's Total Weather.
After the break, does Portland have a long-term plan to mitigate flood damage? We'll hear from people who are just trying to maintain their businesses right on the waterfront.
Welcome back as we continue to forecast our future amid the threat of severe coastal storms.
Today marking 1 year since two historic storms slammed into Maine, and we're saying historic due to the record water levels.
It really was. The water level in Portland hit 14.57 feet just after noon on January 13th, flooding the coast already swamped by record-breaking surges from 2 days prior. Both days saw storm surges higher than the previous record set back in 1978.
That Saturday, Portland police posting this on X, writing that there are too many roads closed to list because of all of the flooding. And even though Portland deals with floods often during high tides, these storms were really a wake-up call for business and property owners on Commercial Street. We spoke with those impacted by all the water damage, including a family member of one of our producers. Terry Stackhouse takes us to Portland's working waterfront tonight for a look at what they're now doing to adapt.
The whole place had to be pulled apart.
Off the walls and into storage. One by one, Casco Bay Artisans owner Jen Swartz moved all at-risk inventory to higher ground in the days before the historic January 10th storm.
This one?
Friend and fellow artist Russ Cox helped carefully carry pieces around the waterfront property and up a flight of stairs. It's a process he calls labor-intensive and anxiety-provoking.
She and her staff are able to make all of these moves, touch all of these pieces of artwork without ever scratching anything.
Measures to limit flooding like sandbags helped.
We put tape out there too.
But nothing could stop the rising water from seeping into the Commercial Street gallery.
It was still somewhat of a hopeless feeling when the water is, it just came and it just kept coming. It was rolling down the wharf, and I knew it was seeping into the gallery.
The gallery is located along the main wharf, owned by Steve Goodrich.
It was very concerning. I was more concerned for the tenants than the wharf itself.
But the storm impact was beyond nuisance cleanup, not just for the main wharf, but the neighboring Custom House wharf, which Goodrich also owns.
So this is where most of the structural damage occurred, is underneath where we are now.
The properties are home to a mix of commercial and industrial space, with a priority to serve the marine industry and commercial fishing.
This did not all occur at the storm, though. This was made worse by the storm.
Pressure from the high tide, Goodrich says, took a toll on the main wharf's concrete.
The tide was such that it actually lifted it up off the piles. And when it sat back down, shims were displaced, piles were broken, and it just really disrupted the structure of it underneath.
There is help on the way. The two wharves were each awarded $2 million through the state's Working Waterfront Resilience Grant Program. But that money has yet to be made available.
We'll probably have to put $1 million or so of our own money into the repairs. It's, by our estimate, about $4.5 million. We did some of the repairs already, began mitigating it just to stabilize the wharf.
Goodrich says he is grateful for the support and appreciates what the city of Portland is doing to administer the funding.
Over here you can see these are examples of the piles and the lumber that we use down below.
Swartz is thankful all she lost was time. That's what she and others are investing now in preparation for the next storm.
And it's how you choose to manage your mind. You can't ignore it, but you have to weigh your situation and then don't look back.
For Maine's Total Weather, I'm Terry Stackhouse.
Meantime, the City of Portland's waterfront director says there is an effort all across city departments to address resiliency and try to prepare for the future and any coastal storms down the road.
Bill Needleman says the pace of flooding from storms appears to be accelerating, and city leaders are meeting routinely with coastal property owners.
It's becoming much more unpredictable, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that while the two storms in January were historic, we had comparable storms in December of 2022, as well as in March of 2024.
He says efforts to adapt infrastructure will continue because Portland can't allow storm-related threats to disrupt the city's relationship with the water.
And the storms hit York County, especially hard in Biddeford alone. Damage from last year's storms costing an estimated $3 million.
So while the city is responsible for repairing the crumpled roads and culverts, many homeowners say they're left on their own. Jim Keithley shows us how some people are still recovering 1 year later.
Coastal homes and roads along Fortunes Rocks Beach in Biddeford battered by that January 10th storm. An astronomical high tide and storm surges damaged the seawall, homes and roads. People who've lived here for decades recall the sights and sounds of that nighttime storm.
I couldn't wait for daylight because all you could see out the windows was sand and rain because the sand was just being blown across the street. It was insane.
When daylight came, the damage and destruction were everywhere. The concrete patio at this home crumbled under the weight of the slamming surf. Twin houses at 79 and 81 Fortunes Rocks Road had been in the same family for decades. The one on the end, teetering on the edge, condemned after the foundation caved in. The home was demolished in February, the existing house and the lot put on the market. 6 months after the storm, a new owner came along and paid $1 million for the home and the lot with permitting to rebuild. Even after a full year, waterfront property owners are still in recovery mode. This house, for example, still on wooden blocks, waiting for a new foundation to be installed. Construction companies that specialize in raising homes are busier than ever. The process is a mix of engineering and science.
We move the house off to an area to where we can get underneath it and work with equipment, get a foundation all going and pour the piers.
Matt Pantoni of Pantoni Construction has been busy last year and has clients waiting for new foundations in the new year. His job to create cement footings and pilings deep into the earth and high enough to prevent the storm waters from causing catastrophic damage. The cement pilings allowing for the water to flow through.
It gives it a place to go instead of hitting up against a foundation, or your house. It gives it a little bit of a leeway.
Pantoni says people are spending the money to protect their investment. Pricing for these projects can run anywhere between $120,000 and $250,000. This is video from Payne Construction Services, another company specializing in this type of work. Customers are taking notice.
We get people that want to get on the preventative and they want to be, proactive on anything that's going to happen. And most of the time it's something that's happened to one of their neighbors that's close, and they just want to be able to, assure that their house isn't going to get washed away.
The York County Emergency Management Agency was on this storm from the beginning to the end. Fortunes Rocks Road repaired within 3 days. The state and the county were approved for federal disaster funds to reimburse for their structural work that still needs to be done. Deputy Director Megan Arsenault says they're still waiting for federal reimbursement funds from storms dating back to 2017.
As far as the reimbursement process and cleaning up damages and helping towns to get back on their feet, it can be complicated for sure.
The work goes on, and so does the planning. With these stronger storms, Mainers are paying better attention, taking the warnings more seriously than they used to. And now we wait for the next one.
A storm like that could happen in another 100 years. It could happen this year. It could happen 10 years from now. It's hard to say, but by knowing what's happening around us, knowing how to get information, thinking about what you might do if a storm like that happened again this winter, whether it's gathering supplies, signing up for emergency alerts, making a plan with your family, those are all ways to be prepared if and when a storm like this happens.
For Maine's Total Coverage, I'm Jim Keithley.
And the sheer power of water ripping open the walls of a historic bell house and washing it right out to sea. Up next, how a small crew made the tower and bell house at Pemaquid Point more weather resistant.
The back-to-back storms last year wreaked havoc at Maine's only national park. Officials at Acadia National Park say it was the most destructive storm to hit since 1978. The storm destroyed at least 1,000 feet of trail and left some roads impassable.
Crews have been assessing the damage and figuring out which areas to prioritize for safety. Park management has conducted several repairs, but they consider them temporary. Right now, the park is still going back and forth with the state over who foots the bill for long-term repairs in the future.
Future storms come with the risk of threatening our state's unique coastal landmarks. It's a big concern for staff at Pemaquid Point Lighthouse after their old fog bell house was severely damaged.
Emily Pike spoke with caretakers in Bristol who say the storms represent a new chapter in the park's history.
Maine has a history of coastal storms, and each one reshapes the coastline. So in January 2024, several back-to-back storms came along, reshaping the coast and reshaping its history. Maine's coastline is no stranger to coastal storms. In January 2024, two powerful storms hit, causing significant damage, especially along the mid-coast. One of the hardest hit landmarks was the nearly 200-year-old Pemaquid Point Lighthouse.
So between the high tide, the
The big high tide plus the storm surge was 20 feet higher than normal.
The large breaking waves tossing anything it can, including large boulders.
That storm that we had January 10th, we had a 775-ton rock break off and move. So what's going to hold up?
The storms taking pieces of history.
That bell, had we not cut it down, would have been lost to sea.
Capturing the damage in real time, Claude Pendleton, the parks commissioner, and Shelley Gallagher, the parks director, had never seen it get this bad in their lifetime. Fast forward to September 2024, and the repairs are complete.
We had to use as much of the original brick that was in the building. So probably 75% of the brick were put back that were in the original building. And then the mason had access to old brick that matched the brick that are there.
The last time the lighthouse was significantly damaged was in Hurricane Bob in 1991. And each time it needs to be repaired, its historic status means that those repairs have to follow strict guidelines using original or similar materials. And while the property has been repaired, the rocks along the coastline are still shifting, making it unsafe to walk on.
Our wall at the end of our parking lot it's a natural structure. It wasn't a built seawall, and that's eroding.
Repairs to the parking lot are being discussed, but they're waiting for a permit from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection Agency, which could take years. In the meantime, the instability of the rocks are dangerous.
We had a couple that was hit by a rogue wave and got thrown a good 40 feet. The wave went completely over them. I was actually here and saw it.
And the risk of future storms will cause further damage.
We can prepare, but we can't prevent. When the ocean wants to do what it does, you just have to stand back and hope you've got everything secure.
Reporting in New Harbor for Maine Stowe Weather, I'm Emily Pike.
And that's really been a persistent message we've heard from people recovering from the storm's impact. The future is uncertain, but that doesn't mean we can't do our best to adapt to whatever Mother Nature throws at us.
And that's all for our special report tonight. For all of us here at Maine's Total Coverage, thanks for watching.
And a reminder before we go, you can always get our forecast, all our storm reporting anytime online on our website, WMTW.com, and inside our app. You can stay on top of any warnings and alerts in your area, even when we're not with you here on the air.
And you can watch all of these stories that you've seen here tonight, as well as future stories that we plan on telling this year as Mainers adapt to a changing world. We know our news and weather departments, of course, will join forces once again this year. Have a great night.